I do the welcoming. So we know one another, we know what we have been working. So I don't want to talk too much. I do want to have 3 points which are nothing to do with the empirical work that will be discussed today, mainly because this will be discussed and I will bring my own observations during the discussions. So 3 points: normative, structural, and more like conceptual. So on the normative side, just I think some of you know already that when I started this project, I really wanted to have global data. This wasn't the first thing that I wanted to do, a global database of naturalization. I think the first event at the EY back in 2017 was how to make it possible. Then I realized that there are so many empirical, conceptual, methodological issues, and we somehow put it on the side. But I see what Emilienne is doing. I see from my perspective, and some other here in the group, the most significant contribution actually can be also normative. Mainly because for customary international law, it's super important, it's a part of customary international law to understand what countries do. And customary international law is part of, it's a major branch of international law. So eventually what I'm trying to say is that what Emilienne is trying to do has also, in addition to the empirical contribution, a very important normative contribution to understand where international law is standing. In a way, what we already have, I mean, the most significant thing that we have in international law is the genuine link doctrine, which is not so updated. I mean, Ashley is writing her dissertation on that, trying to offer something more significant than what we already have. And in international law, when it comes to naturalization, there is almost nothing, but certainly very little on the regional level. The American Court of Human Rights and other European Court of Human Rights define very little the criteria means for naturalization when it comes to regional law. So anyhow, to make a long story short, it's highly important, I think, from the normative perspective. And I do hope that next year, before the ERC is over, I can put in like a first draft or global compact or guides for future global compact on citizenship. And this is something that would be super important to understand how to judge legitimate or illegitimate, lawful or unlawful naturalization policies, while understanding what we already have on the empirical side. Second, conceptually, I was trying to convince Emilienne, but we'll see, to go into the typology that I originally had on divisions. This is not so much compatible with the typology of global SIT, but what I had in mind is a typology of naturalization goals, then criteria, and then means. And the idea, I think, from a legal point of view, was that in order to have a lawful, legitimate, morally justified naturalization policy, the state would have to justify all the three, meaning that the goal, let's say cultural preservation, national security, whatever, is just legitimate or justified, but also the criteria, let's say the cultural background of the migrant, and the means, whether it's oath or test or residency and so on. And what ideally I had in mind is that something that there will be a spectrum of things that must be required, let's say genuine link, things which should never be taken into account in naturalization policy, let's say race or ethnicity. And in between, there will be this, from a legal perspective, again, this discretionary margin or margin of appreciation in which the state can play with. This is, I think Emilienne has offered a much better, this was my original idea back in 2017, and Emilienne has offered a much more nuanced and structural and also systematic index. So the third point is more about that. I really want to use that opportunity to take Emilienne, because in a way, I couldn't make it myself, and this requires, it's not just pioneering, but also ambitious and important and central. And I want to thank you for bringing it all together, also bringing all these people together to think together with you. And the way I see it is more like also kind of a feedback mechanism to brainstorm with you on what are the future directions that we should all take. And since it's a very friendly collegial forum, I think we can, hopefully we can make the benefit, that some benefits to your own index. So anyhow, thanks a lot. And the floor is yours.
Well, many thanks, Liav, for sharing these thoughts with us. I'm sure that they will be super helpful during the day, and we'll have the chance to come back on what you say on the different points that you said on the normative contribution that could be made, also a contribution at the conceptual level, and also in terms of methods, or yeah, about the structure of the indices that we can build on naturalization in a global perspective. So I'm very happy to kickstart today's event with this brief opening remarks, and to have such a great lineup of speakers to engage with the topic of the workshop. So thank you very much for being here. Of course, I would have preferred to invite you for a glass of Prosecco while enjoying the views of Florence, but this was not unfortunately possible. This is not possible for the time being. I'm delighted to be online with you. So as you know, this workshop will analyze the interests and challenges of conducting comparative research on naturalization in a global perspective. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Maarten Vink, and I'm a Max Weber Fellow and Research Associate to the Global Citizenship Governance Project at the Robert Schuman Centre, and I am the organizer of this event. My current postdoctoral project, which I will present in more detail during the day, is directly related to the topic of this workshop, which makes me really excited for today's discussions. So I'd like to thank Leah for suggesting the organization of this event and for his support throughout the process. And also a very special thanks to Valentina Bettin from the Robert Schuman Centre, who's been of considerable help in the preparation of the workshop. So many thanks, Valentina, for all the work that you've done. Before I give the floor to Maarten Vink, who's very kindly accepted to deliver the keynote address of this workshop, I'd like to say a few words about the importance of the topic that we'll be dealing with today and the main objectives of this event. Although to different extents, naturalization provisions and practices remain of key importance for immigrants across the world, as these allow them to access rights and opportunities restricted to nationals. More than 1/3 of immigrants worldwide settle in low or middle income countries, and 3/4 of the refugee population lives in African, Asian, Latin American, or Caribbean states. So this means that the rules and processes that condition naturalization matter to significant numbers of immigrants beyond Europe and Northern America. And yet, the study of naturalization rules and processes remains very much Western-centered, and the research undertaken to compare policy variations beyond European or Northern American examples is scarce. Thanks to the work undertaken by different research teams, data on naturalization and citizenship acquisition policies for immigrants are becoming available on a wide range of countries worldwide. To take a few examples, the 2020 edition of the policy index MyPax, which we will hear more about this afternoon thanks to Giacomo Solano, measures the naturalization policies of 52 countries spanning across Europe, North and South America, Asia, and Oceania. The Global Citizenship Observatory, or GlobalCit, provides databases on naturalization and other modes of citizenship acquisition that cover more than 170 states as of now, 177 if I'm not mistaken, but Maarten will present important updates on these databases in a moment. The collection of these data makes it possible to develop new comparative research frameworks that go beyond the dominant European Western-centered perspective that we find in citizenship studies. There is, I believe, a strong case for the development of such comparative frameworks to test the generalizability of explanations for policy variations developed in specific contexts, essentially European and Western contexts, as well as to contribute to the formulation of new hypotheses or theories to account for convergences and divergences across time and space. However, the lack of data in different world regions and the need to adapt extant indicators to the different realities of naturalization rules and practices at the global level still raises a number of important challenges. The purpose of this workshop is precisely to reflect on the opportunities and challenges that the construction of a comparative research agenda on naturalization at the global level involves. Today, we bring together scholars who are contributing to the collection and analysis of new data on naturalization policies worldwide, and the workshop should be the occasion to discuss on what conditions the advancement of a research agenda that takes a global comparative perspective on naturalization can work. The discussions that we'll have today should also form the basis of a symposium that we would like to publish as a working paper with the Robert Schuman Centre, so do stay tuned. Now, regarding the programs of today's meeting, we'll start with a keynote address by Maarten Vink. Maarten will present new material from the updated global databases on modes of acquisition and citizenship acquisition, obviously, and share his thoughts on the opportunities and challenges for comparative research in this area. We will then move on to the first panel of this workshop, chaired by Jelena Jankic, whose recent research on citizenship by investment programs is a key contribution to the advancement of a global comparative agenda on naturalization. In this panel, I will present my current postdoctoral project entitled Divergent Paths to Citizenship, Policy Variation in Citizenship Acquisition for Immigrants in a Global Perspective. And I will respond to comments and questions from two distinguished discussants, namely Isolde Honohan and Marcin Royce. After a lunch pause, we'll start again at 3 p.m. with a second panel on the construction of policy indices on naturalization, chaired by Mark Helbling, who wrote several pieces on this particular topic. We'll have the chance to listen to three specialists in this domain: Lucy Pedrosa, who recently co-authored a comparative analysis of existing policy datasets and indices in the field of migration and citizenship; Samuel Schmidt, who's developed a new policy index called Citrix, measuring the inclusivity of citizenship acquisition regimes in the OECD countries; and Giacomo Solano, who coordinated the latest edition of the MIPEX citizenship strand. Finally, the workshop will end with a roundtable moderated by Ashley Mantha-Hollens, whose own research articulates a global comparative perspective on citizenship policies. This roundtable will be the occasion to engage with core questions that this workshop raises, touching upon why and how comparative research on naturalization can and perhaps should expand beyond Western contexts. We'll listen to four specialists of comparative research in the field of citizenship and migration: Rainer Baubach, Erin Chung, Bronwyn Memby, and last but not least, Katharina Natter. So this is a full day event, and knowing that it can be hard to stay on Zoom and concentrate for such a long time, we'll have several breaks between each panel. And we're planning to take pictures that we would like to share on social media. So I know that most of you have signed the consent form, but not everyone. So if you do not want to appear on these pictures, please just let me know privately and on the chat, and we'll figure out other moments during the day to take pictures with those of you who accept. So without further ado, I leave the floor to Maarten Vink. Well, I'll keep the introduction brief because I'm sure that everyone knows Maarten, but let me just say that Maarten holds the chair in Citizenship Studies at the Robert Schuman Centre. He's the director of the Global Citizenship Research Area within the Global Governance Program at the Robert Schuman Centre, and the co-director of Global Cit. He's written extensively on immigrant naturalization and comparative citizenship regimes, so we're delighted to have you with us, Maarten. One last thing, I'll be acting as a moderator for Maarten's keynote, and the workshop being organized as a Zoom meeting. Everyone has the opportunity to ask questions directly to the speakers. So if you have any questions for Maarten, please feel free to write them in the chat, or just use the raise your hand function on Zoom after his talk, and we'll take up to 20 minutes for a Q&A. And I will invite you to ask your questions directly. So Maarten, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Emilian. Just to check, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thanks a lot. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see you all online and to be among friends and discuss the topic of comparing citizenship and naturalization policies. So Emilian, thanks a lot for the invitation, and Emilian sort of gave me a carte blanche to talk about what I felt like talking about. And what I would like to talk about today is the question of how to compare citizenship regimes globally. I will also deal with specific issues of naturalization policies, but I thought I would start with a talk more generally about citizenship regimes. A, not to duplicate things that will be said later by Emilian and others, and B, to maybe start off with a more general discussion, because I think many of the issues that I will bring up also are relevant for discussions more specifically about naturalization policies. And I will talk about maximum 40 minutes. So Emilian, you should stop me when I talk too long, so that we have some time for discussion left. I shared my presentation with a couple of the people in the audience already, so I'm very much looking forward to your comments. Now, citizenship regimes, comparatively, I think it's extremely exciting field of study. It's in some ways a very well-developed field of study. I think we have a long tradition of literature to build on. We have a rich interdisciplinary literature bringing together lawyers, sociologists, political theorists, political scientists, or political economists, perhaps even. And so there's a quite diverse and I think exciting field. So in that sense, citizenship, the comparative study of citizenship is quite well developed. At the same time, I think when we talk about comparing citizenship regimes globally, actually, I still have the sense that we are in the initial stages of the field. Of course, there are case studies of country studies around the world available. There are increasingly more regional studies. So Bronwyn Mendy is in the audience and has done, of course, great work on Africa. We have colleagues within Global Cit who have done work on Latin America, for example, Asia. Country studies, regional studies are becoming to be quite well developed, but a truly global research agenda, in my view, is still in a relatively initial phase. And yeah, there may be several reasons for this. One of them is certainly traditional disciplinary backgrounds that yeah, people have looked at this more from area studies or legally oriented case studies, and also something related to data availability. Now, what I want to talk today about is yeah, a couple of things that are transversal to the debates about comparing citizenship regimes. And in particular, I would like to talk about the empirical building blocks of such a comparative exercise. And the challenges that the going global brings with it, to use the to refer to the title of the workshop today. And when we talk about these empirical building blocks, there are actually three elements that I want to discuss. First of all, conceptual elements. What are actually the dimensions of comparison? And I think when we go global, actually comparing becomes more complicated. Within Global Cit and the predecessor Euro Citizenship, we've done a lot of work on comparing within Europe. But even though it's obvious that when you go global, we encounter many different issues, and one of the issues that we certainly encounter is a larger variation in terms of the dimensions of comparison. And so we need to think about issues of variation that fall on our plate once we go from comparing 15, 20, 50 countries to 190 countries. So I will talk today about some of these more methodological issues, but I will also illustrate the cases with the some of the data that we have just starting to complete at least the first data collection phase on the 2020 update of the Global Cit modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship data set, which now covers 190 countries. And I've been working on that very intensively with Luc van der Baren, who is also in the audience today, and also with Isolde Reiner and Bronwyn, thinking along in terms of how to conceptualize some of the variation. So conceptualization will be a major issue, but of course there are also measurement issues, in the sense that the comparative work also becomes more complicated in the sense that we need to think maybe more carefully about what are the empirical indicators that we can use, and especially the discrepancy between the legal information from citizenship and nationality laws, and how that corresponds to the reality out there. That's obviously something that is becoming more problematic once you go global and you enter into parts of the world where we cannot take for granted, we can never take for granted, of course, in any part of the world, that the law always corresponds to the social reality, but in some parts of the world it's maybe more complicated than in other parts of the world. And thirdly, and these are the three issues, conceptualization, measurement, and aggregation, that I take as I was inspired to discuss these, especially by, I think, a path-breaking paper by Vink and Verkuilen that is cited very widely in the field on democracy, but also in fields of related indices, for example, immigration policies. A great paper by Bjerre et al., including Mark Helbling, who is also here in the audience, on conceptualizing and measuring immigration policies. So these two papers both bring forward these three issues, and those have, I think, not yet been fully, not being discussed to the full extent within the domain of citizenship studies, and certainly not from the perspective of going global. So the third issue of these three issues that I wanted to talk today about is aggregation. And I think this is important to discuss before we go into the exercises that Emilienne will present and that we will also discuss in the afternoon, namely the exercises of index construction. And index construction, of course, an index is an aggregation of lower level empirical indicators. I will talk about yeah, how that is, in my view, more complicated once you go global compared to doing this in Europe, or, for example, within the OECD, as Sam has done, or MyPact within a still relatively restricted set of countries around the world. Yeah, there are two sides to this. Based on the new data that we are collecting with GlobalCit, we can actually do this now much more easily than we could do so until now. So this is the advantage. The disadvantage is that it also becomes more complicated, and I want to share a couple of reflections with you on this. And I will be mindful of my time so that I get through my slides. Okay, so let's talk a bit about these three issues: conceptualization, measurement, and aggregation. And conceptualization, of course, starts with concept definition. What actually is the concept? But we should also think about, yeah, what are the constitutive attributes of the concept that we want to measure. And then thirdly, clarifying conceptually the hierarchical relation between these attributes. And what's important, right, the lesson that we read in the literature, for example, Vink and Verkuilen, when we compare yeah, policies, and also especially when we want to bring these various elements together into an index, is that we should avoid both maximalist and minimalist definitions of the concept that we're working with. And yeah, the maximalist definitions in our field of citizenship, you can think, for example, of the need for a relatively yeah, limited conceptual understanding of citizenship. And of course, as we all know, citizenship is has potentially a very wide range of meanings, including social identity perceptions. Those, of course, may be very pertinent to the concept of citizenship, but when we come on to compare citizenship policies, regimes around the world, yeah, I think we should avoid those kind of maximalist definitions because it becomes more difficult to actually compare across countries. And so we need to minimalize the concept of citizenship to some extent. At the same time, we should avoid too minimalist definitions because we don't want to exclude theoretically relevant attributes. So you can think, for example, of talking about dual citizenship. It's a topic that we see in the news a lot these days. Dual citizenship, of course, is relevant not only for immigrants. Somebody has to renounce their citizenship before they become the citizen of a new country, but also for immigrants. And so when we want to understand dual citizenship, we should avoid minimalist definitions that are purely focused on immigrants, but also take into account that dual citizenship has other legal meanings, especially provisions that imply the loss of citizenship from the origin country perspective. Right, so in the rest of my talk, I will take the global cit definition, which you can find on our glossary, which we've updated not so long ago. So you can find that online on our website. Citizenship as a legal status, relation between an individual and a state that entails specific legal rights and duties. So these rights and duties, they are of course important, but they are not taken along in our comparison. So what we are comparing is the status that will give access to those rights and duties, but we don't compare the variation in the rights and duties that come with citizenship between states. That's something within Global Cit that we do in a separate project. For example, Rainer and colleagues are doing now a project on electoral rights for non-resident citizens and for resident non-citizens. So those are obviously very pertinent to discussions on citizenship, but I don't take them into account when I talk about comparing citizenship regimes. Now, citizenship regimes then follows that when I talk about citizenship regimes, so more broadly than the narrow concept of naturalization policies, are institutionalized systems of formal and informal norms that regulate the conditions under which the legal status of citizenship can be acquired and lost. So what's important here is the couple of things: institutionalized, so there needs to be some kind of a regulation, but I also include both formal and informal norms, and that's, I think, a really important element to our discussion. Within Global Cit, we are mostly focused on the formal elements, so the nationality legislation, and that's to a large extent driven by pragmatic concerns, in the sense that we have to start somewhere. Yeah, let's start with capturing the information from the nationality laws. But of course, informal norms are also important, in the sense that as soon as there is a wide discrepancy between the formal and the formal norm and the practice, then of course the formal norm becomes less meaningful. So it is important to capture also some of these informal understandings and policy practices. That's something that we do try to take on board, for example, in the country reports by our country experts. But that's something that, yeah, I will end my talk with. That it's also something that we need to be maybe even more mindful of than we are already when we go global. I think it's very important, first of all, to capture all the variation in formal provisions, but also to keep in mind variation in informal norms. Now, when we talk about regime typologies, it's important that, of course, citizenship regimes can vary in many ways. I've done work, for example, on this with Rainer Bauburg, where we bring in the dimension of territorial inclusion and ethno-cultural inclusion, and those are two dimensions along which regimes may vary. We look at, in that paper, we look at only at European countries, and when we go global, I think it's important to think of other dimensions along which countries might vary. And especially, Leof actually already mentioned this in his introductory remarks, especially, I think, something like liberal versus illiberal norms. And that's something that we now also are able to capture to some extent with our new data collection within Global Cit. And that's certainly one thing that going global brings with it, that we have a much wider variation of citizenship regimes. And we have, yeah, a set of, certainly a set of 15, 20, 25 countries where we can clearly see that there's also variation in illiberal norms. So countries that use explicit gender discrimination, group discrimination in their citizenship laws. And secondly, dimension that we need to be mindful of is the effective versus ineffective regimes. Now, very briefly, as a setup for the afternoon, naturalization, of course, we in Global Cit refer to as modes of acquisition after birth. Now, it's important that naturalization policies are sometimes used colloquially as a synonym to citizenship policies. Emilian will say more about this, how he understands naturalization policies in his talk. Within Global Cit, we clarify that naturalization, of course, is also a procedural characteristic. It's something that we specify in our modes of acquisition database. And one question that I would put on the table here is that when you talk about naturalization policies, do you refer only to what is sometimes referred to as ordinary naturalization, which in our revised mode database of Global Cit, we now refer to as residence-based acquisition of citizenship, mode A6, or do you also include special naturalization for citizens of specific countries or for people with some kind of ancestry? So these are things that are captured in the overall citizenship regime typology of Global Cit, and they may or may not be included in naturalization policies. Okay, so once we clarify concepts, we need to think about constitutive attributes, and there are two elements that are important here in terms of the scope of variation. And of course, when we go global, this may bring with it some specific issues. And these two issues are the grounds of acquisition, and that basically covers what we in Global Cit cover our typology of modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship. Is it possible to acquire or lose citizenship on certain grounds? And I will say a bit more about this in a moment. And actually, when we go global when we have gone global with Global Cit, we, I think, discover to our satisfaction that this typology of modes of acquisition and loss reasonably well, actually, I think it very well stands up to the test of going global. So our comparative typology is quite well applicable around the world, and certainly in these 190 countries that I will talk about in a moment. Secondly, conditions. Right? So within these modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship, of course, we need to identify comparable grounds of acquisition, loss of citizenship. And this is where I think we have now made a major step with GlobalCit. Some of you who will be familiar with our database on modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship will know that under conditions we have so far tried to standardize the language a little bit, but this still remains to some extent idiosyncratic, and we have now done a systematization of this by identifying the major categories along which countries vary. Right, so for those of you not familiar with this, our typology of modes of acquisition of citizenship covers 26 modes. So all the various ways in which one can acquire or citizenship, from birthright to naturalization to special naturalization. The main innovation that we've made with this 2020 update is adding also, specifying also the conditions for naturalization. And that's something that I think people like Emilienne, Giacomo and Sam will be interested in the sense that we are now more explicitly identifying residence conditions, renunciation conditions, and so on under the modes of the residence-based acquisition. Secondly, modes of loss of citizenship. Of course, it's important to be aware that you can not only acquire citizenship, but also lose it. You see here that there are fewer grounds of loss, but still quite a few, and I will say something about how this varies across the 190 countries in our updated database. So when we talk about constitutive attributes, we need to think about not only the grounds of acquisition and loss, but also within those grounds, what are the conditions for acquisition or loss. And here I think it's really important to be aware of this liberal versus illiberal dimension. Again, Liaf may be interested in this following his opening remarks, but I think it's this is actually one of the main lessons that we have learned with our Going Global exercise, that once we compare provisions around the world, and of course we knew this already, but we can now also identify this more specifically. We see that there are also not only, you could say, different legitimate distinctions based on residence or sufficient link requirements, dual citizenship restrictions, which all fall in the realm of generally acceptable different conceptions of membership. But there are also quite a few countries around the world where we find arbitrary distinctions. And of course, in Europe, when we go back in time, we would find also similar kinds of distinctions, especially when you think discriminations based on race, gender, religion, ethnicity, or membership of a particular social group. And that's something that we now explicitly identify in our GlobalCit data set. Another element is operative capacity. So I think we need to be very mindful of this. It's not easy to capture, but there are some statistics available which are well developed, provided by the United Nations, for example, on birth registration, that indicate that this assumption that the law corresponds to reality is more problematic in some contexts than others, and especially in contexts where we have very low birth registration rates, and sometimes lower than 50% of the population. We can identify, of course, the birthright citizenship provisions in the nationality law, but they may not be operative in the sense of giving people access to citizenship on those grounds if their birth itself is not registered. Apologies for going a bit fast, but there are some important things to be discussed, and I want to get also to some of the empirical examples of our database update. So when we talk beyond liberal versus illiberal distinction, or operative versus ineffective citizenship laws, of course we can identify various distinctions in the paper that I referred to already, that I wrote together with Rainer Baubach on citizenship configurations, where we look at 36 European regimes. we looked at these 8 issues that you see outlined here, and those correspond, with almost all of the modes of or many of the modes of acquisition and loss we identify in our typology, and certainly some of the most prevalent and most symbolically important ones: birthright, naturalization, special naturalization, and also loss provisions. And within those elements, we can look at specific differences, and I will get back to some of those. Okay, the last element of conceptualization is related to hierarchical relations. So we need to identify not only the empirical attributes, so a specific mode of acquisition or loss, but also think about how those various modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship relate to each other. And this is, of course, especially important when you talk about indices, where we aggregate a number of requirements. Again, Emilienne will talk more about this. I would say, first of all, indices are interesting, of course, for specific purposes. They give you a snapshot indicator of differences along a single dimension, inclusiveness for immigrants and their descendants, for example, when we talk about naturalization. But as you already understood by now, citizenship regimes are much more varied. So there are many more elements, and when we talk about all those modes of acquisition and loss, I think all of us would agree that a single index based on all of those elements wouldn't make a lot of sense. So we cannot aggregate all of that into a single dimension. And so the starting point for me would be a completely non-aggregated approach, where we actually look at individual indicators for expatriate dual citizenship, investor citizenship, to name just a few. And that's something that in itself is, of course, extremely pertinent, and we will increasingly be able to better understand by developing longitudinal data sets that captures the trends in those on those specific issues. So first of all, we don't have to aggregate. The individual indicators are interesting in themselves, especially when we want to understand outcomes, right, such as immigrant naturalization rates. We need to understand expatriate dual citizenship policies in the origin countries. Secondly, we can think about limited aggregation. So we could aggregate certain birthright modes, such as birth rules for birth in the country and out and abroad, or for territorial birthright. Jus soli, double jus soli, facilitated acquisition based on birth in the country, and the same for dual citizenship. If we want to take a comprehensive approach, we should look at both dual citizenship, you could say, for immigrants and for emigrants. Right, but then a next step might be indices. So here, just to give you a brief sense of what you will see in the afternoon. Sam will talk more about this in the session on indices, citizenship regime inclusiveness, Citrix, that he has developed, I think convincingly, capturing many relevant elements for about access to citizenship for immigrants and their descendants. And MyPEX is presents a slight variation, but it's overall very broadly comparable. And that's something that, of course, is useful for very specific purposes, discussions about immigrant inclusion. And one question that I'm posing here is how well does this translate when we apply this beyond Europe, beyond the OECD, globally, right? And here again, I think one particular problem that we, and especially people who work on these indices, need to think of is this discrepancy between, first of all, that not all countries in the world actually have residence-based naturalization, but secondly, also the discrepancy between law and the practice. Okay, let me go to the empirical part to share some of the data with you. So what we have been doing within the Global Cit is updating our modes of acquisition and loss of citizenship data set. We will present this in a new Global Citizenship law data set, which will cover not only this information on modes of acquisition and loss, but also longitudinal indicators on specific indicators such as dual citizenship, birthright, We are working on investor citizenship indicators. Yeah, this could eventually be done for all of the modes of acquisition and loss that we are interested in. So this is initially a qualitative database. It's grounded in articles in nationality laws. It identifies relevant procedures and the conditions under which citizenship may be acquired or lost. What the main innovation in this iteration of the dataset that we add is that we now specify the conditions for acquisition and loss in predefined categories, and this will make it much more easy for all of us to identify the main patterns in variation around the world, which currently is still difficult on the basis of the existing modes of acquisition and loss databases. So this covers 190 countries. We cover 34 acquisition modes, including the naturalization specification modes and 15 loss modes. So this adds up to 9,310 entries. As I already mentioned, Luc van der Waren has done a lot of great work here. So kudos to Luc for doing all the work together with the regional coordinators of Global Cit and our country experts. We are still in the process of fine-tuning the data and also validating the data. So we don't want to rush the online publication until we are confident that this is well organized and valid. But I'll show you some initial findings from the database. So as I said, first of all, with regard to our typology of modes of acquisition and loss, what's in a way reassuring is that this can be applied well around the world. So we did not bump into new modes of acquisition or loss that we could not fit in our comparative typology, first of all. Secondly, when you look at, and here you see a plot where we look at how many modes are present in per country. We see that of course there are countries such as Uruguay that have only 2 modes of acquisition of citizenship, and then there are countries like Greece that have 23 ways in which citizenship can be acquired. So we see that there is a lot of variation, but actually overall, when we apply this to our typology, we see a relatively nice normal distribution, which I think is reassuring from the perspective of our typology. So the median, you could say on average, countries have about 10 to 11 modes of acquisition of citizenship. And we see the same type of normal distribution for when we go to loss of citizenship. On average, about 5 modes of loss of citizenship. Again, Uruguay is the country with this time with the least modes of loss of citizenship. So we see that actually in Uruguay, citizenship is both difficult to get, and once you have it, it's impossible to lose it. Whereas there are countries like the Netherlands that are, could say record holders of ways in which you can lose the citizenship. And I'm sure René de Groot can say more about this. We see that the most frequent modes are voluntary renunciation, L1, but then there are also, you can also lose it through detection of fraud in the acquisition process or disloyalty or treason. Thirdly, what we now map with our new global database is residence-based acquisition requirements, dual citizenship, whether you need to do a language test or not. And also we specify the nominal year of residence that are required for residence-based acquisition in these 190 countries, according to the nationality law. So that's a major caveat, and I'm sure we will talk more about this in the afternoon. But I think here for ordinary naturalization, that's of course a particular issue that requires attention, especially when we feed this into indices that measure inclusiveness of naturalization policy. So a country might identify in its citizenship legislation that you need to reside, for example, 7 years in the country, and this is the case with Greece, if I'm correct. But in the particular case of Greece, you actually need to reside for 7 years in the country with a permanent residence permit, and you can only get that permanent residence permit after having lived already in Greece for 5 years, if I'm correct. So the total added years of residence would be 12, right? And that's why we see that in MyPax and also in Citrix, 12 years are used as a reference point for the nominal years of residence. And that's one particular element where we need to be mindful of when we go global, that this discrepancy will be increasingly more difficult to capture the more countries we assess and the more varied the legal and administrative context. So what you see is a snapshot of what is in the nationality laws. We see that there are 15 countries that actually do not have what we consider to be residence-based ordinary naturalization. And for those countries that have this, by far the most frequent required number of years is 5 years of residence in the country. Secondly, there are also quite a few countries that have 10 years. And then there are about 20 odd, let me see, 15 countries or so that have actually more than 10 years, right? In addition to those that only have requirements for very specific groups or none whatsoever, and this ranges up to 40 years, for example. I'm going to skip this with an eye on the time. Okay, so let's talk about aggregation in the last part of my presentation. I already mentioned this aggregation. What do we do with the individual constituent attributes of citizenship law? So we measure AO1A, a citizenship that can be acquired by descent for people who are born in the country, and the same, we specify this in Global Cit for those who are born abroad. So first of all, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at the variation across the 190 countries within these single indicators. And yeah, in many ways, maybe the default approach would be to be conservative and not to aggregate beyond these individual indicators. They are already very informative themselves. And what's interesting now that we identify these predefined categories, and we use similar kinds of categories in AO1A and B, born, birth in the country and birth abroad, is that we can see that, first of all, the one mode of acquisition that is present in all countries around the world is a form of jus sanguinis for people who are born abroad to a citizen, right? And that's important when we talk about regime typologies. Maybe the most used typology around the world is still this distinction between jus soli versus jus sanguinis countries. But as you see here in AO1B, jus sanguinis for people who are born abroad exists actually in all countries. So even Uruguay has a provision for the acquisition of the citizenship of Uruguay to a citizen, to somebody who is born abroad, to a citizen of Uruguay. And then there are 17% of countries, 30-something countries that do not have jus sanguinis in the country. And these, of course, are the countries that have jus soli, right? So they attribute, like the US, they attribute citizenship by birth on the territory. Now, what you see is that within birth in the country, if there is jus sanguinis, there are very few, generally few restrictions, apart from some countries that have group or gender restrictions. But when we look at provisions that apply to those born abroad, we see that there are more restrictions, and Ashley will be especially interested in this. We see a quite prevalent, what we might call sufficient link restriction in about 40 countries, according to the data that we have now collected. And these are typically restrictions indicating, well, there's a generational limit. Somebody can only transmit citizenship if he or she is born in the country herself. Provision, if somebody is born abroad, that they should take up residence in the country at some point in the future in order to maintain or sometimes acquire citizenship. So there are those sufficient link restrictions are quite relatively prevalent, and we also see that there are often relatively frequently dual citizenship restrictions. So citizenship is only acquired abroad if somebody doesn't acquire the citizenship of another country. Okay, a couple of minutes to wrap up. We can do the same for use solely, where we can group some of the provisions for a single use solely and double use solely. And yeah, we see that in about 40 countries around the world, we find that there is an unconditional use solely. Then there is similar, slightly fewer a number of countries where we have conditional use solely, such as Germany, based on residence, or birth, such as in the Netherlands or France, the so-called double use solely. We can also split those categories. And then there are also 6% of countries where we have gender or group restrictions. Dual citizenship, we can combine the modes of acquisition, AO6B, with the modes of loss, LO5. Dual citizenship for immigrants and emigrants. And we see that by now in most countries around the world, dual citizenship, or let's say in half of the countries around the world, dual citizenship is accepted for immigrants and emigrants. In about a quarter, this is not accepted for neither immigrants or emigrants. And then, in 12, 17%, it's either accepted for immigrants or emigrants. Two empirical things to share still. One on liberal versus illiberalism. That's, I think, something of major interest when we talk about going global, based on our new data and also the predefined categories. We can now identify countries that have what you might call liberal versus illiberal practices, and basically only transmitted if the father is a citizen rather than the mother. Or it is only accessible to people who are from a certain ethnicity, or sometimes in a few countries from a certain racial background. And I would also understand as illiberal countries where you can acquire citizenship, but you cannot voluntarily renounce it. So you are in a way caught in the citizenship of a country, and that's distinguished under our loss provisions. And what we can now do with our new data set is identify variation across countries. And we see that, about half of the countries actually, there is no form of illiberal practice. There are no arbitrary distinctions, and you can renounce citizenship. And also, if you are an immigrant, you can acquire citizenship under some form of residence-based naturalization. But that also means that in almost the other half of the countries, we see forms of illiberalism, and in most countries, we could only identify one mode, right? If we look at these as an example, these 10 selected modes, and this, by far has to do with restrictions on renunciation. So there are 63 countries around the world where actually you cannot renounce, or where there are strong limits with regard to renouncing your citizenship, right? So, for example, this may be not possible at all, or only for naturalized immigrants, but not for those who have acquired this by descent, which is quite common in the Americas. And then we have about 14, 15, about 30, still about 30, 40 countries where we find more frequently illiberal modes. And you see listed here the countries such as Brunei, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, where we might identify 6 modes of acquisition or loss which follow illiberal principles. And so this is something that I think is interesting to take into account. Last empirical slide has to do with Citrix. I shared this already with Giacomo and Emilien and Sam, so they might comment on this later. But what we can now do based on the newly updated global CIT data and also the systematized data is identify the particular grounds of acquisition for immigrants and their descendants more easily so that it becomes less complicated for people who are interested in building indices for naturalization or for immigrant and descendants access to citizenship more generally. So that's in a way reassuring, and we see that once we do this in a slightly adjusted form based on the available information, this correlates actually quite well both with Citrix and with MyPack, so that I find reassuring. There are a couple of outliers that you might look at more specifically, and we see once we apply that to about 69 countries, where I have done this only for those countries that have at least high birth registration, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't make much sense to look at the birthright rules for the descendants of immigrants and that have at least some form of residence-based acquisition. We see a lot of variation. This is, we see here the Americas are topping the chart, and European countries such as Austria or some Baltic states are the most restrictive countries. The main question that is
that we lost Maarten.
There is a problem with this connection.
Yes. So let's hope that he reconnects. Perhaps in the meantime, we can check whether everyone has access to the raise hand functions in the reactions option at the bottom of your screen, because some of you, I think, had issues with this option.
I made the speakers co-host, and depending on the version of Zoom you have, it might create problems. I made you co-host so that you have all the options available in terms of a sharing screen and so on. But if you cannot raise your hand, just let me know and I'll change your status, and it should work at this point.
Perfect. Thank you.
I'll send a message to Maarten as well.
Yes.
Anyhow, for asking questions, how do you do it, Emilien?
So I was thinking of taking, let's say, 2 to 3 questions in a row, and then give Maarten the opportunity to respond before taking another set of questions. So for those of you who can use the raise hand function, just use it, or otherwise you can just write your questions in the chat. Perfect. So now Bronwyn can use the raise hand function.
Thanks. Yeah, it was because if you're co-host, you don't have the function. Yeah. So
okay.
Yes, I have a question which is for Maarten, but he's just reconnecting, I see. But anyway, it was about when he was talking about.
Here is you, Maarten. We lost you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what you always see when you are talking. You were thrown out, but I think it was time that I stopped anyway. So thanks a lot for listening, and sorry for dropping out in the very end of it. I look forward to your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Maarten, for your presentation. And I'm sure that all the points that you made on conceptualization, measurement, aggregation will be very important for our discussions during the day. Yes, so we'll still have, let's say, a little bit more than 10 minutes to take questions. So we're suggesting that we take 2 to 3 questions and give you the opportunity to respond before moving on to another set of questions. So I already see some hands raised. So there was, I think, Bronwyn who wanted to go first, and we'll have Liav and Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Maarten. That was great. It's so nice to see all of that work so suddenly popping up in a graph. It's just like that, a graphic. It looks so simple, but there's so much work behind it. Years and years of work, in fact. I think I recall coming to a first meeting of this at least 10 years ago. So, I mean, I've got many questions, but I'll restrict myself to one for now, which is your categorization of regimes from liberal to illiberal. And I was wondering how you were deciding whether a provision was liberal or illiberal. I mean, of course, I have a general sense of that, but there are some provisions that you could say might, you know, it'd be quite subjective to decide whether they're liberal or illiberal. So what categorization are you using there?
Thank you, Bronwyn. Leah?
Yeah, thank you. Maarten, this was fantastic. I learned so much, and thank you so much. It looks really comprehensive, systematic, and super interesting. I have a lot of kind of conceptual, also methodological and theoretical issue, but let me just focus on one point, and you might had something to say about it in your last section, where to go from here, that we didn't see. But for me, like I look at it at the end, kind of from a lawyer perspective, and I ask, okay, now what the international law scholars can do with that, and how we can use these categories to think of kind of lawful, unlawful, legitimate, and illegitimate international law guidelines. And I think that the liberal and illiberal distinction is probably not the most helpful one. And I also think that the modes can tell us little on kind of from a legal perspective, whether it's legitimate or illegitimate, because everything can be kind of context related. So I'll give you an example. For instance, I don't think that international law can say per se whether civic requirement, civic knowledge requirement or language requirement is lawful or unlawful. But if you follow like the distinction of goals and means, let's put aside the criteria, then there is much more material to work with. Because for instance, I would imagine that ethnicity or even race can be legitimate if it's compensation, if the goal is to compensate for past wrong, let's say like the European policies for prioritizing people from the colonies or the Israeli law of return. But obviously in most other cases, it's unlawful. And it would be the same with criteria and means that seems lawful, and yet the goals can change the things. So I wonder if there is anything we can say on each of those modes, or maybe other modes, with somehow splitting them regarding the kind of what is the ultimate goals that we want to achieve, and what are the means used to achieve that.
Thank you, Liev. And Mark?
Yeah, thanks a lot. I also found this very fascinating to see this going global. One question is also about this differentiation between liberal and illiberal. It would be great to see how you define this actually, and how you conceptualize this to understand this better. Because I mean, to some extent, you can say, I mean, we have this debate about basically every single citizenship law in every country, that there are so-called illiberal and liberal aspects that. That some groups are discriminated against, and you know, is a language test that is even something like that might be considered illiberal from a certain perspective because it disadvantages certain groups. And then I was also wondering, is this just a different concept for restrictiveness? So is illiberal just more restrictive if it's more difficult to get it through only your father and not your mother? And so what is then the difference? And I think in any case it would be useful. I mean, I'm not sure how you will then group these countries to not have just two groups like illiberal and liberal countries, but in any case, I think it would be more useful to have some kind of scale that, you know, that's like democracy scale. Countries are not just democratic or non-democratic, but more or less democratic. So that might be in the end useful. A more general question concerns maybe also your understanding of citizenship regime. I wasn't really sure whether you mean something like citizenship governance or regime in the sense that you include all different phases of a naturalization process, so also implementation and things like that, Or is it even broader that the whole decision-making process, the whole governance actually is included there? And I think this might be particularly relevant when you go beyond countries we typically study, where all these like informal aspects might potentially at least get more important, and then the whole regime concept gets even more important if you not just study formal laws, but the informal implementation of laws, for example, when you go outside Western countries. And so I would be interested to hear your thoughts or your experience with the data collection, to what extent all these more informal aspects get more important in these countries we typically don't know as well as we do European and North American countries. And then partly related to that is then also the more methodological question of reliability. To what extent we can be sure that the data is collected in the same way by all in all these countries. And by that I don't mean that experts or the people who collect this data don't do their job, but they regimes might be so different in different parts of the world that the understanding of what this formal regulation is so different that we cannot be sure whether the data actually measures the same thing, or how can we actually ensure this, or how did you do it in Global State project to make sure that these specific regulations have been understood the same way and are applied in the same way.
Thank you, Mark. So these are great questions for Maarten. Maarten, you have the floor to respond to those questions.
Thanks a lot, and indeed great questions, and indeed from all three of you on this distinction, liberal versus illiberal, and then Leah, for what to do with that, and Mark also some questions on methodology, for example. So indeed, I should have expected, and I expected this, of course. So if you introduce a concept of liberal versus illiberal, that this will catch people's attention, and actually I think that's what I also intended. So that's good. Probably indeed I could have talked about that for 40 minutes. It's something that goes back to a paper that some of you have seen, that I started to work with Isolde and Reiner, where we started to think about conceptualizing regime differences. But it's also something that is now becoming apparent once we have collected the citizenship legislation information for these 190 countries. That there were, I would say, generally speaking, there were differences within an acceptable realm, and differences that are problematic from at least from an international law perspective. Those could be captured by this distinction. And to go to Bronwyn's question, how do we categorize this? So I'm relying here also on what Isolde discussed with me and Reiner in this earlier draft of our paper, where we identify liberal membership conceptions as they must be grounded in the rule of law. First, equal treatment or non-discrimination before the law, and thirdly, respect for individual autonomy or choice. Right. So, non-discrimination and autonomy or choice. That's what I would say. Is most important. And of course, rule of law, in the sense that if you apply for naturalization and your application is rejected, you should have legitimate ways to contest a decision, and so that's also important. And so non-discrimination would be based on all those countries where we find provisions where distinctions are made on the basis of a race, gender, religion, ethnicity, or membership. Those I have now considered to be arbitrary distinctions, right? And that's something that goes back, I think, to international law. So there are foundations in international law to consider those kinds of discriminations arbitrary. Leof then brings in the point that within the context of a specific country, of course, certain kinds of distinctions may be politically justifiable, right? Right, so we had not so long ago the Global Cit webinar on diaspora governance, where we had also a colleague talking about citizenship in Liberia, and that's of course where you have the so-called Negro clause. And from an international law perspective, that I think is clearly problematic, but that doesn't mean that within the Liberian context there is not a certain political justification for this, right? So that I admit that that's a difficult discussion, but I do think that generally speaking, if there are grounds in international law to compare these kind of provisions and to consider some provisions arbitrary rather than others. And so that, to answer Mark's question, I would not say that this is something, I would say that this is something different than restrictive, right? So restrictive is something, citizenship within a liberal conception, maybe citizenship may be more or less restricted, and that's what I captured to some extent with this adjusted CITIC index based on the indicators that we have. Right, and there we still see differences between Austria and Portugal. Right, so the Austrian citizenship is much more restricted than the Portuguese. But these are restrictions with which one might consider restrictions variation within the liberal conception. And I realize that maybe countries like Austria are pushing what some might consider a liberal conception. But I think this is that's I think a really important discussion to be had within the field of citizenship studies, and that's actually I think a discussion that so far we didn't have. If you think about democracy indicators, for example, there is a lot of debate about what do we consider to be a democracy or not, what's the difference between a liberal democracy and an electoral democracy. And for those kind of decisions, we also need to have understandings of what we understand as a liberal democracy, right? The rule of law, contestation, and these kind of things. And I think that's something that actually for citizenship, that's a discussion that we should have, and we are now starting to have some empirical building blocks on this. One thing to add to Leof here is that I think actually when you talk about the global compact, these are exactly the kind of things that I think should fit into this, because those are kind of discussions when we talk about the international governance of citizenship. Those are discussions that we cannot avoid. So you need to have discussions about standards, and that's actually I think something that I haven't been involved with too much. So the colleagues in the audience who are lawyers, of course, are much more familiar with those kinds of discussions. But I think they are important discussions to be had, and we need to conceptualize those kind of distinctions. Very briefly to Mark's points on, so I would say that citizenship regime is not the same as governance. So I think we should capture law and to some extent implementation, because if the law is so far away from the implementation, then it doesn't make sense to look at the law. So this is something where that is actually difficult. So I don't think we are there yet, but I think it's important to have that ambition and to think about the years ahead. How can we capture to some extent some elements of implementation? And that also brings me lastly to the point of reliability, data collection, where we base our work very much in the law. So we look at legal provisions. We ask country experts and regional coordinators to help us interpret these legal provisions. I think my main ambition for the next couple of years is to do this even in a more systematic way. Again, I'm thinking of ways in which this is done with democracy indices, such as the VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy project, where country experts are asked every year to fill in questionnaires. And those kind of questionnaires also include not only questions about the legal situation of the political regime, the constitution and electoral laws, but also typically some questions about, well, to what extent is there actually contestation? How does this work to some extent in practice? And those are, I think, questions that we should start asking in a more systematic way. So we can now get them from the country reports from our experts, and we should start asking them in a more systematic way. And I think we are now at the point, and that's why we did this exercise, where we have a much better understanding about the kind of issues that we that we want to know, right? And that we need to ask. And so we are, and I think, a good starting point to further elaborate this. So at the moment, I think we have a relatively reliable understanding of whether there is a legal provision on a certain mode of acquisition and loss, and what the general distinction is. But yeah, in terms of the practice, we of course still lack information, and I think that's where the next phase would be. That was in my last slide, right? So that's where I think we can still make very important steps. Thanks.
Many thanks, Maarten, for these responses. So I know that we ran a little bit out of time, but perhaps let's just take one or two final questions, and then we'll have a pause before our next panel. So I know that Victoria raised her hand. So Victoria, if you want to activate your microphone, and you can ask your question.
Thank you so much. Maarten, thank you so much for the presentation. It's wonderful to see such extensive data and all the hard work, of course, that's gone in the many years behind it. And I know today we were talking a lot about the global and going global in the aggregate, but I had a question that you might have addressed on one of your last slides, kind of digging into it, moving forward with the research, not at the global level, because of course, we've seen some of those initial charts today, but I'm wondering, you know, looking at regions or time periods or type of regimes, what are your recommendations of how we can start digging into this data that you have presented here today? Like which years do you have? I know you presented 2020, but can we look at patterns in the modes over time or within different regions? Like, what would you recommend to kind of start digging into this data and using it global level or on a different level? And in that way as well, this is how we can start checking for, you know, accuracy and changes over time within and between countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I see that, Liav, you have one short comment before I give the floor to Maarten to respond.
It's not a question, it's more like a comment. Maarten, thank you. I see your point. Just one brief comment. I don't think that the liberal, illiberal distinction, which is very appealing, would be much helpful for international law. And Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, because not everything which is illiberal would be unlawful in international law and vice versa. And I think that the way we work, at least from a legal perspective, would be to find a connection, this proportionality between the means to the goals. And from the modes that you describe, if I kind of try to say, okay, what I'm going to do with this data now to design a kind of future regime in international law, I think none of the mode I can say whether it's legit or illegit without knowing this, what's the goals for the none of them, because everything can be both lawful and unlawful depending on the connection between the means and the goals. So I'm just saying that if you redesign it, it would be nice to take those considerations into account so that the data then would be more useful for a normative perspective.
Thank you, Liav. Maarten?
So first of all, I think maybe to clarify, clear up a misunderstanding. So the modes are not in themselves liberal or illiberal, right? So we have birthright modes and naturalization. And so those are the particular grounds, and those have particular purposes, right? So that's something that Rainer and I reflected on, right? So for example, descent, of course, has an birthright modes to have an intergenerational connection purpose, right? So to transmit community across generations, and that's important. You know, people like Dmitry Koshnov who disagree, but for most of us, we agree that for regimes, it's important to have some permanency, right? And that's expressed through the birthright modes. And the naturalization regimes, of course, have different purposes, right? Residence-based naturalization has an inclusive purpose to deal with migration, consequences of migration, whereas special naturalization has, you could say, the purpose of dealing with long-term consequences, you know, long-term diasporas or people with special connections or, you know, particular priorities of a country, right? Like investor citizenship, right? Which then maybe investor citizenship is one example of a mode where there is a lot of discussion about whether this in itself is liberal or not, or acceptable or not, right? So that may be one of the only exceptions of a mode. But even there, I would argue that it's more about the good practice, good governance standards than about the practice itself. But the modes in itself are not liberal or illiberal, right? What is illiberal or liberal is are the distinctions then being made, right? If we say, well, you have access to citizenship if the parent is a citizen, but only if the father is a citizen, right? And that's, I think, an illiberal distinction, which is grounded, I think, also in standards in international law, in the sense that these are considered to be arbitrary grounds. Right? That doesn't mean that that there may not be wedlock consideration, for example, right? It's very important, of course. Establishing who is the father requires a different procedure than establishing who is the mother, right? So in that sense, of course, there are legitimate distinctions, but once we have established who is the father and who is the mother, it shouldn't matter for descent whether the father or the mother is a citizen, right? And that's, I think, quite well defensible. And the same for residence-based naturalization. So you may have reparation clauses, special naturalization for historical reparation. That's, I think, also could be justified. But for ordinary residence-based naturalization to deal with the consequences of migration and establish political inclusion, there should be some kind of general access, irrespective of gender or origin, for people resident on the territory under some reasonable conditions, right? And residing 40 years in a country, I wouldn't consider that a reasonable condition, because that's basically exclusion rather than inclusion. And I think those are exactly so we are only at the beginning here, right? But those are exactly the kind of discussions that I think we haven't had so much. Right. Of course, there have been philosophical, theoretical, legal discussions about this, but from a global regime governance perspective, I haven't seen very strong discussions on this. Of course, there's great work done by René de Groot and Olivier Vonk in their work on the standards of international law, which I think also provides a basis for these kind of discussions. Very briefly on Vicky's point, so this was indeed the last bullet point of the slide that you didn't see, of the where to go from here. So research agendas. So at the moment we have only snapshot cross-sectional data for 2020, right? For all the modes of acquisition and loss. What we do have is longitudinal data for some selected indicators, especially dual citizenship, expatriate, where we can go back to 1960, and we are now also doing this for the immigrant renunciation requirement, where we go back in order to understand the determinants of those trends, right? Treat that as a dependent variable, and also look at the consequences of those trends, for example, in naturalization rates of immigrants. And the ambition certainly is to have longitudinal indicators for data for all our indicators, but yeah, that's something that we have to do it step by step. And my ambition for this 2020 systematization exercise was to first very clearly specify the categories along which provisions can be divided. And once we have a good idea of that, then do the backcoding back in time, right? And as I also responded to Mark, we also still need to systematize our relations with the country experts. They need to provide data, and to go to country experts and ask them to provide longitudinal data for 34 modes of acquisition and 15 modes of losses. Yeah, that's a major exercise, and we have been able to do this ourselves for individual selected indicators. And yeah, my hope is that within the next certainly 3 to 5 years, we will have this completely coded for all modes of acquisition and loss back in time, right? And then we are talking more or less to 1960. But so this will be the medium-term ambition that at least I have, and that we, yeah, now I think based on this exercise, we have also the some further means to actually put this into practice, because we need to first understand properly the global variation before we can think about fully coding this back in time. I will stop here, Emilian.
Thank you very much, Maarten. And well, thanks again for your presentation. Thanks everyone for your questions. I'm sure that we'll have the occasion to come back on some of the points that were raised during this this session.